Nigga won't smoke, I put that pain in. Judge tried to hang him, couldn't show up to the arraignment. Hot boy, it's 227, if it ain't that, fuck as you claim. Creatures, niggas ain't gang when they...
Detroit rapper Boldy James has made waves in the last 3 years in the underground scene. This is in part to his close association with Griselda and The Alchemist. His slow, methodical flow has become a staple in his music and makes him an instantly recognizable artist. Boldy has also collaborated and rapped on some of the best production the underground scene has to offer, and has a great ear for it as well, which is in my opinion his greatest strength. While Boldy James is a very strong rapper in terms of lyrics and beats, his flow is great at times, but can sometimes fail to pick up the slack when he's on lackluster beats. He is, though, still an instantly recognizable figure for anyone that pays attention to the current underground sound. In this video, I will be reviewing Boldy James' discography one album at a time. The minimum for this series has been at least 3 albums, but in the case of Boldy, we'll be doing 7 of his most important works to his overall discography. I will be assigning a score 1 to 10 for each album, and at the very end of the video, they will be averaged out to assign him an artist score. So without further ado, let's get into the video.
Hey, them on, get a brick, break it down, hit a lick, take you down, take a city, rape a town. 80 big ones in the ceiling, tell that bitch don't make a sound. 80's baby still in prison, wish that I can break.
The Price of Tea in China is a very hard album to evaluate. The production here, for the most part, is pretty dark, but I think it works great with Boldy's style, but it does lead to some tracks feeling a little stale by the end. The album is kicked off by the track Karuth, which is a more vulnerable song for Boldy. It has a sadder tone, but works great with Boldy's voice and flow. It is immediately followed up by Giant Slide, which is an okay song, but drags on for way too long. Like that song though, there are a couple songs on here that fall victim to the same shortcomings. The worst example of this being Speed Demon Freestyle. This is the only song on here I'd say is bad and I really dislike. The tracks Pinto and Mustard are also not as bad, but are super boring as well. The track Surf and Turf is very similar to these songs as well, but is definitely saved by a solid Vince Staples verse. Speaking of the features on here, the 2 best tracks that appear on here have 2 heavy-hitting features. Scrape the Bowl is a dark banger that has Boldy and Benny the Butcher trading bars for the chorus. Turns out as a great track and easily the best track on here. Snort with Freddie Gibbs is also great here and is a great performance by Boldy as well. The only other tracks I'd have to shout out are Great October and Run-Ins, which are great tracks in their own right as well. I think for the most part, the slow, dark theme of this album works mainly in part to the small flashes of energy provided by the Alchemist beats and feature artists. Like I said, this album is great for what it is and is an album worth checking out. The best songs on here are Snort, Run-Ins, and Scrape the Bowl. Overall, a very solid album, so I'll give it a 6.5 out of 10.
Baby on the way, damn it's a mess. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Yeah, check, get in a box to the left, say no, fresh out the box with a fresh new caseload. Step out the box for a sec, thank you.
Manger on McNichols is a dark, depressing, and sad album. The album pretty much describes some of Boldy's life and the pains of growing up in a poor Detroit. The production by Sterling Tolles on here, for the most part, is beautiful, and most of the skits and spoken word work decently with the rest of the album. The first track is easily my favorite song, Medusa. This track is beautiful and one of the only songs I feel like really works well individually, which is my main gripe with this album. A lot of these songs are crafted to flow with the album, but it's hard to listen to them individually because of the long interludes and spoken word. Tracks like Detroit River Rock, BB Butcher, and The Middle of Next Month are all very sonically pleasing tracks that just have a lot of cool, but sometimes annoying filler. This album, in terms of cohesion, flows perfectly, and a lot of the weight of this album's score when I get to it is just based on the overall experience, especially on the first listen. This album, though, is straight up emotionally brutal, with the climax of this being the track Mommy Dearest. This track is beautiful, but in it, James states that he thought that his mother should have aborted him. The track Welcome to 76 is just alright, but I will say it is the only other track I could see someone listening to outside the context of the album. Requiem is a very smooth and good track that fits great into the album, and the final track is a long and beautiful outro with many progressions. This track is beautiful, but no one would really listen to this by itself. Overall, this album is probably one of the most cohesive albums I've ever heard. In fact, if I didn't care about individual replay value, I would see this album as a 10 out of 10. However, due to this, I have to lower it. My favorite songs though are Medusa, Mommy Dearest, and Requiem. I'd have to give this album an 8 out of 10 though.
Following lunch with Clue, Tans, Will, Pierre, and Mike. Stu and Bullock back with me and Gopher had to share a slice. Used to have fear of flight, scrubbing my toothbrush on a pair of nights.
This album is Boldy James' debut on Griselda Records, and I couldn't be more disappointed. This album is 100% listenable. It's just one of the most boring and insignificant Griselda-affiliated albums I've heard. This album really features very little memorable moments or songs. The most memorable moment to me is the Westside Gunn feature that appears on here, which is horrible. Maria and New Wave are fine starts, but every song ends up very similar to these and it gets stale fast. The only track I can actually take away from this album and say is great is Long Live Julio. The beat on here is amazing and Boldy James does his thing. Cartier, though, is another song I just consider to be bad. The beat is pretty boring and El Camino just makes the track worse with his verse. Overall, my thoughts on this album are very short and to the point. I don't like this album. I think it could have been so much better. But I guess my favorite songs are Maria, New Wave, and an emphasis on Long Live Julio. This album is bad, and I'd have to give it a 3 out of 10.
Sergio Notacini, plug do Gianni, nigga no Versace. Still serving blow out the guinea, stepping on the coke like a pair of Rachis. In the spizzy running up a check with them 36s and them.
Bo Jackson is a glorious return to form for Boldy James and might be some of his best rapping in his career. He once again teams up with The Alchemist, and the results are even better than their previous collaboration, which was still great. The first 3 songs on here are some of Boldy's best work and is an awesome way to start the album. Double Hockey Sticks is an amazing opener with a sick beat switch, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the album. Turpentine has a great Boldy verse and a beautiful beat. The album is sped up a little bit with the track Brick Mile to Montana. Benny the Butcher's verse on here is amazing, and Boldy delivers as well. This track is an absolute banger and is one of The Alchemist's most in-your-face and aggressive beats. The album has a lot less filler tracks that are super average though, as the only tracks I feel this way about are EPMD, Diamond Dallas, and Illegal Search and Seizure. The last tracks are a bit disappointing too. They're pretty boring, and it's a shame that the album ended on that note. Some of Boldy's best tracks show up on here too. Photographic Memories is beautiful and has great guest verses from Rock Marciano and Earl Sweatshirt. Fake Flowers has a great Freddie Gibbs verse over an unsettling, but at the same time, great beat. Some of the other great songs that appear on here too are Steel Wool, Flight Risk, and Third Person. These tracks all fall in the same category of great beats with solid Boldy performances. They are completely necessary tracks to this album and do push it forward. Overall, this album is a great producer-rapper pairing and turns out great. The improvement on Price of Tea is very good to see too. I really do love this album. My favorite tracks on here are Photographic Memories, Double Hockey Sticks, and Brick Mile to Montana. This album is amazingly produced and Boldy kills it on the rapping, so I'd have to give this album an 8 out of 10.
I was just a morph in the flame, but aspiring to be a boss in the game. Dear diary, I missed the Scarface with the cane. Blame my father, he who put the cross on the chain. Seen a nigga get chalked for $1 bill.
The Alchemist and Boldy James are back at it with this album, and the results aren't great, but still good. This album, to be honest, seems to be Bo Jackson leftovers, but there's some great moments on here that I think should have come out. Even though a lot what seems to be B-sides on the album, it's surprisingly cohesive and solid. First off, one of my personal favorite songs from him is on here. The track Moth in the Flame is amazing, the beat is intense and menacing, and Boldy goes off and drops some of his best verses. No Laughing Matter has a really fun sample, and Boldy is good on it as well. Turns out to be a highlight on here. Hot Water Tank is a weird track, but it works out pretty well and is also a highlight on here. That's about it for great moments on here though. The track 300 Fences is solid but nothing crazy or memorable. Level Tipping Scales and Bumps and Bruises at the beginning are pretty lackluster, and Guilt and Francis at the end are kind of the same. This is a very short album, but I feel like outside Moth in the Flame, which is an outlier, there isn't as much quality on here. While it's still good and listenable, it just isn't as good as Price of Tea and is nothing near Bo Jackson. My favorite songs though are Hot Water Tank, No Laughing Matter, and Moth in the Flame. This album I feel was very necessary to come out to cap off Alchemist and Boldy's great run, but in the end, I still just have to give it a 6 out of 10.
Big city, small China, started a small time. Scared to dwell on my past, I got Alzheimer's. Toting my 30, me and girlie pulling all-nighters. She made me wish
Boldy James opts to work with Nicholas Craven instead of the Alchemist on here, and it turns out great. The overall atmosphere of this album is nothing like Boldy has ever rapped on. It's a very upbeat and bright album, and Boldy fits great on it. A lot of the credit here, though, does go to Nicholas Craven, who really puts Boldy in a spot to succeed at this album. This album starts off with a bang with Straight and Tall and Stuck in Traffic. Straight and Tall has a beautiful sample on it, and Boldy James fits great on it and performs great as well. It is followed up with Stuck in Traffic, which is an upbeat banger. This is probably my favorite Boldy James song, and one of his best. It's a very underrated track. The tracks I don't care for here are few. Scrabble, I think, is just a mess of a song and should have just been left off. Monterey Jack, Six Toes, and You Ain't No Menace are very mediocre songs, but I guess I can understand their inclusion on here. I think this album is amazing, and it honestly rivals Bo Jackson to me. Nicholas Craven really brought a refreshing array of beats that turn out great. This album is a must listen, and the tracks Stuck in Traffic, Straight and Tall, and O Tray 9 are my favorites from it. Since this album is on par with Bo Jackson, I'll have to give it an 8 out of 10.
got the R's from my auntie, syrup from my granny. Chop a switch on fully, keep a Glock in handy. My bitch pretty pink, pussy tastes like cotton candy.
The final album I'll be including is Mr. 1008. This is entirely produced by Future Wave, who I'm not really familiar with, but I don't know if he made the best beats for Boldy to be on. This is the first album where I feel like the beats put a lot of emphasis on his rapping, but its success is streaky on here. On one hand, tracks like Disco Fever and My Double Trigger, Boldy raps great and steals the show. Tracks like Mortimer Milestone and The Whole Hundo are tracks that are very familiar for Boldy, and they turn out great. Dormans is another track that has a very minimal beat, but Boldy and the feature do a good job of keeping it interesting. However, all the highlights show up in the first half of this album, as it completely falls off a cliff in the second half. All the songs feel like dollar store Alchemist beats with an average Boldy James verse slapped on them. The only track that does not feel like this is Indivisible, which still has parts that sound like Alchemist, but the synths and parts of it set it apart. Thankfully, this album is short and to the point, because I could see this album being really bad if it was extended. The album still has some good moments, but I feel like the good is the same as the bad. My favorite songs are Mortimer Milestone, Disco Fever, and Dormans. This album is just very average, so I'd have to give it a 5 out of 10.
2-7, fully blue Prezi, finally touched his first 20K, whoop-de-doo peasant, 52 blocks, this shit was too precious, 32 shots, key one up top, these niggas too jealous.
Boldy James has a very solid discography. It's far from perfect, but has some great highlights. After assessing his score, his average artist score is 6.36. This puts him right above Juice WRLD and pretty far under Travis Scott. Thanks for watching though, like and subscribe.